Well, let's start. What's your name and what's the group you're part of, or just your intro you could do?
Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association and a member of several different advocacy groups in New Jersey.
And what got you involved originally in the Lackawanna Cut?
Well, you have to go back almost to the beginning because my next door neighbor when I was growing up, I grew up in South Orange, New Jersey. My next door neighbor was a retired conductor on the Lackawanna, and he and his wife took me on a trip from, would have been Brick Church to East Stroudsburg, which went over the cutoff, and that was in 1960, so I was 3.5 at the time. And I remember the trip bits and pieces because it's not only a long time ago, but I was small at the time. But that started it. Now, I didn't get involved for almost a quarter century, as it turns, after that. But it was always in the back of my head, and as a result, when the opportunity presented itself, after the tracks were removed and there was an effort that I joined, the group I joined, North Jersey Rail Commuter Association, they were trying to save the right-of-way, and that's when I became involved. So that was about 1985. So that's really when I became politically, advocacy-wise involved. But I feel like basically my whole life this has been a part of me to some extent.
That's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Well, let's go over a brief history then. Why was the cutoff built in the first place?
Well, in order to understand why the cutoff was built, you have to understand that the Lackawanna Railroad, which ran from Buffalo to New York, or Hoboken exactly, originally had planned to merge with the Central Railroad of New Jersey. And in order to do that, when they were building the connecting line between the Central Railroad of New Jersey and the Lackawanna as it was moving east, this is in the 1850s, the decision was made to build a railroad from Delaware, New Jersey to Hampton, New Jersey, which is quite a bit far south of here. Well, it turns out that merger fails, and now the Lackawanna is stuck with this line that is really not useful to them. I mean, it's useful in the sense that they use it, but it's not optimal by any means because it's a circuitous route that has been created because they end up running, it's a long story, but they buy a different rail line called the Morrison Essex and now have basically a much longer route than they really want.
And that's the old road.
That's the old road, yes. And what happens is that they, especially after President William Truesdale takes over in 1899, start looking at alternate routes. And eventually this is what is built. It's opened in 1911. But they investigate a number of different routes, but they wanted to replace the old road with a new road. And the new road was the cutoff. That's almost a Cliff Notes version. There's a lot more to it, but basically that's the reason why.
And then how long did the cutoff take to construct, and where did they start with it?
Well, construction officially began on August 1st, 1908. And the first revenue train operates on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1911. But it's built in 7 different sections, which more or less start construction simultaneously. So by late August, September, the whole 28.5 miles is under construction simultaneously. Some parts got finished sooner than others, like this is finished by the beginning of 1911, and there are tracks on it. But there are parts that east of here which languished. There was let's say there were problems, and as a result, it it was originally supposed to have been a 3-year project. It turned out to be 3 years plus, well, it'll be supposed to have been August, so September, October, November, December. So it was like an extra 4 months that it was delayed just because there was construction problems.
Okay. What are some of the biggest landmarks on the cutoff?
Well, this is one of them. This is the Haynesburg Viaduct, or also known as the Paulinskill Viaduct. Paulinskill referring to the river, which is just off to the side here. There is also a viaduct which crosses over the Delaware, known as the Delaware River Viaduct. That one's not as tall as this. This is 117 feet tall, 1,100 feet long. The Delaware River Viaduct is 65 feet tall, but 1,450 feet long. Other structures on the road, I mean, everything was built out of concrete with one exception. On the cutoff, the thing is though that really, technically the biggest structure is the Peak West Fill, which is a 3-mile long fill between Andover and Greene Township in Sussex County. So that really is the biggest thing on the cutoff. But obviously the two viaducts are, you know, something that everyone gravitates towards because, you know, just because they're so big as well.
Well, the fill is impressive because it looks like a natural hill. It's so big.
Yes, it's about it varies in height, but its maximum height is about 110 feet, which is, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but it was supposedly the largest railroad fill in the world when it was built, since Eclipse, but at that time it was at least touted as such. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but that was something that was advertised as, and it was certainly it was of great interest to engineers from around the world who came to visit, you know, the whole construction project, because it was really, at that time, what they were using in terms of their technology, which of course would be primitive by today's standards, but they were using steam shovels and things that really, and the way they were actually creating embankments, and particularly embankments, was considered to be, you know, state of the art, you know, from 1910 or so.
Let's see. How fast were trains able to travel on the cutoff, and how fast compared to the old route?
Well, if you're talking about, the rule of thumb was that the cutoff, which ran from Port Morris to Slateford, and the old road ran basically from the same 2 points, but was 11 miles longer. So you're talking about Port Morris to Slateford Junction in Pennsylvania is 28.5 miles by the cutoff, 39 by the old road. The rule of thumb was that it took about 20-25 minutes longer via the old road to go with a passenger train, and about an hour with a freight train. Now, in terms of speed, there are no official records, but I've had communications with folks who were in the locomotive of trains back in the late 40s, early 50s, where they reportedly pinned the speedometer, the 100-mile-an-hour speedometer. So going westbound on the cutoff. So we have reason to believe that trains were able to do 100 miles plus per hour on the cutoff. The speed limit varied. The official speed limit varied. It was 80 for much of its time, 70, 80, 75. It varied, but trains could actually, in certain places, go actually a lot faster.
Yeah, part of the reason why I asked that question is, since we're talking about high-speed rail, a lot of the things that the Lackawanna Cut did, all the cuts, fills, all the grade leveling, that allowed, that's what high-speed rail is today. It's doing all of that stuff to allow gentle curves and whatnot. And how is the Lackawanna Cut curve-wise compared to the old road?
Well, when they built the cutoff, the intent was to be able to maintain a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit, with one exception of a curve which is at the Delaware River Viaduct, the other side. The curvature is on I'll call it the main part of at least the New Jersey part of the cutoff, that the curves are either too degrees or less. They're on the old road. You look at curvature. Don't quote me, but I think the maximum is either 4 or 5 degrees, and there's some. So you're talking about a lot of 45 and 50 mile an hour speed restrictions. The only speed restriction on this line, as I mentioned, on the other side of the Delaware River Viaduct was 55 miles, well, depending on the year, 50 or 55 miles an hour. The rest either 70 or 75. There's some curves which are 80 miles an hour. So basically a train could easily go 70 miles an hour across without having to slow down, and it go faster, but then would be subject to speed restrictions. So it was not, at the time, that was, I think, we're just at the cusp of where they realized that maybe they even would have, if they had built it differently, they might have built it with even like a, higher speed curves. But that didn't happen. They actually had talked about building what would have been called an airline, which would have been basically you draw a straight line from Port Morris to Slateford with no curves. The problem with that would have been the cost. This whole line cost $11 million in 1911 dollars.
Which is like upwards of 1 billion, right, today?
Probably. When you consider what the land acquisition and construction costs, sure, I think it's easily could have been 1 billion. But the airline would have cost $17 million, which doesn't sound like a whole lot more now, but you're talking like the difference between 1 billion and $1.5 billion. And I guess they didn't see the need for doing that. Nowadays, if they had done it, you'd say, wow, that would have been great. You'd have a straight line. But in those days, this was good enough. And this was state of the art as it was. And the thing is with the cutoff, you have to look at the topography of northern New Jersey through which it goes. All your mountains are going like this, and the cutoff is going like this. So that's where you get the cuts going through the hills, and then the fills going through the valleys between the mountains. So that's why this was such an expensive proposition. And so what makes it, I guess you'd say, amazing is the fact that it was able to do that. I mean, otherwise it would have been like a roller coaster ride if they hadn't, if they hadn't decided to actually try to, level it out as best they could.
Yeah. So you kind of already answered this earlier, but if you could do like briefly, where were the trains going when they used the cutoff? Like coming from, going to? Well,
let's start with the passenger side, because the passenger side was the more notable, but essentially trains went from, they started in Hoboken and would have come across going westbound to Buffalo, but from there you could have gotten connections to Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, places like that. And then eastbound, of course, it's the same way in the opposite direction. But much of the passenger traffic, certainly later on, I'll talk about like after into the 20th century, would have been to the Pocono Mountains during the summertime, even during the wintertime, but especially the summertime for the resorts. So from a passenger perspective, this was a scenic line on top of it also. I guess you could have enjoyed the trip along the way as well. Freight-wise, it's a little bit more complicated because freight could go almost anywhere, and there were different connections. The cutoff didn't have any connections to other rail lines itself in between, but at either end, there were connections with other railroads, so you have freight going, you name it basically. But basically freight going the same direction, but there were many branch lines, especially like in Scranton. And really, the rationale for building the Lackawanna Railroad, and certainly the money that helped build the cutoff, was from coal, anthracite coal out of the Scranton Valley.
Let's see. What is the future of the cutoff, and what is currently being planned by NJ Transit?
Well, I'll call it phase 1 of the reactivation of the cutoff. That's mine. There's no official phases, but I'll call it that for the sake of the understanding of your audience. Phase one is the extension from Port Morris Junction between Lake Apacong and Netcong on the Montclair-Boonton line, from Port Morris to Andover, which is just a little under 7.5 miles. That is in progress right now. There's a tunnel, Roseville Tunnel, which is really the biggest, I'll call it, sub-project for that extension to Andover. Of the 7 miles, there's already 4 miles of track that's been laid, but Roseville Tunnel is really, that project is due to start later this year. They're in the bidding process right now, New Jersey Transit is. So actual construction, at least according to the present schedule, is due to start sometime after Labor Day in 2020, and that'll take 2 years. Now, exactly when rail service will begin, I can't tell you, because the rest of the project could be done within that 2-year period. That's up to New Jersey Transit. Don't know exactly what their plans are, but they've talked about an extended period beyond that. But that I'm not New Jersey Transit, so I can only say I can only repeat what they've told us.
And then my next question sort of leads into what I guess you were going into. Do they eventually want to extend service into Pennsylvania or to Scranton?
Well, that becomes either phase 2, 3, or however you want to, whatever nomenclature you want to use. Certainly, I don't think it's any secret that the people in Pennsylvania, and the focus is really the Pennsylvania Northeast Regional Railroad Authority, they are pushing for funding to replace the 21 miles west of Andover to Slateford Junction, where the tracks begin again. So there's a 21-mile gap in addition to...
Those are owned by the Erie-Lackawanna currently, right?
It is owned by the state of New Jersey. So the cutoff, which is when I really first became involved, the push was to try to get the state of New Jersey to acquire the line. That took about 15 years, because it didn't happen officially until 2001. But it's in the state of New Jersey's hands, so it's publicly owned. But in terms of replacing the track, that's we're going to be talking about a combination of federal and state funding. Now, New Jersey Transit's position is kind of, they're not necessarily going to push for the service west of Andover. That's really, I think, going to be coming from Pennsylvania. Yeah. The impetus is really for extending to Pennsylvania. So, but as what that time frame is, I can't really say. I mean, there are, will it go all the way to Scranton, or will it just go to the Water Gap or East Stroudsburg in the initial phase 2 or 3, whatever you want to call it? I can't say. That really is dependent on it depends on how much funding is available. More funding, more, further service going further west. Ultimately, though, the goal is to get to Scranton, which is an interesting thing, because the incoming president was born in Scranton, has, historical ties to Scranton. Will that help? We'll see.
Well, that sort of leads to my next question. Does Amtrak want to return service to the cutoff for service to Scranton?
Well, the Scranton route, as you would call it, of which this is part, the Scranton route is on Amtrak's 2035 map. Does that mean that this will happen by 2035? Well, there are lots of maps that have been drawn over the years, and things don't necessarily happen. Could it happen? Sure. I mean, let's put it this way. It's interesting and cause for some optimism that it's there. Does that automatically basically, does that mean that we're going to be seeing Scranton service by 2035? I don't know. Certainly, it's a possibility. It's interesting, though, that it's there, and we're obviously there's no objection from us about that. But once again, I think this really pulls in where you talk about Pennsylvania, and also there's also been talk about combining forces with the state of New York to possibly push all the way to Binghamton. I don't know if all that stuff will come together, but those things are definitely have been thought about, and even going as far as Syracuse. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but these things have been talked about. But all of that is predicated on putting back the tracks in the cutoff. When that happens, whenever that happens, then all that other stuff becomes possible. And where does it end? I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see.
Well, that kind of leads to the next point. You're pretty good at this. What do you, in your opinion, what is the biggest roadblock to all of this? Do you think it's just funding, or I guess, yeah. Well, funding is always the roadblock. In other words, if you have the money, it certainly, it doesn't guarantee you can build it, because there can always be roadblocks. We've had the money to build to Andover for over 10 years now, but the line has not been fully built to Andover because of environmental issues. Those have been resolved, but then there's issues with things going on at New Jersey Transit, and then so there can be roadblocks. Certainly money is always the biggest roadblock, but it doesn't mean that doesn't automatically translate into you being able to build a project. You have to do other things, comply with different regulations. Often environmental ones are the ones that are going to bite you. But I would say it's always a combination of politics and money. They're intertwined. But if you can get the money, that's certainly the biggest first step. If you don't get the money, you're not going anywhere. But once again, that doesn't, you have to do more than just get money. In your opinion, what are the best reasons why the cutoff should be restored?
I see the cutoff as symbolic for not only being able to reactivate an abandoned line, which in my opinion should never have been abandoned in the first place, but the need for it, when I first became involved with this project, it was really with the intent of saving the line and then down the road reactivating it. Historically, since the time of Route 80, which is about 4 or 5 miles south of here, and basically runs parallel with this line, we've seen that the traffic issues are not going to get any better. And giving the option of allowing for commutation or just regular, I'll say, passenger service between Pennsylvania, northwestern New Jersey, and New York, certainly is something that we see as could be of a great benefit. And when I'm talking about the possibility of going even further, I think you talk about almost a regional type of approach, where you can talk about maybe Binghamton, New York, or Syracuse, New York as a possibility. I'm not the ones who have proposed that. There are other proposals that have been out there for quite some time about that. So, and all this is hinging on putting this rail line back. So, I see it as an investment in the future. And yeah, it does have a symbolic value, because it's, aside from its engineering accomplishments, there's certainly something that I think that where we can see a revitalization of the corridor, where we're not just dependent upon having a car, where you can take a train.
That's a huge part of the channel. So yeah, you basically hit it on the head. So one more question before I guess you can add whatever, but regarding the closure of the cutoff, oftentimes what Conrail did to a lot of the lines in the Northeast was compared to the Beeching Act that happened in the UK train system, which was when the government basically took over all the lines but killed a lot of branch lines or unnecessary redundant lines. Do you think what Conrail did here was necessary because there was a lot of redundant lines, or what is your opinion on that?
Well, let's maybe discuss first what Conrail did, and then whether they should have done it or not.
Yeah.
That's
Talk about whatever you want.
Yeah. What happens? Well, we should talk about maybe just a quick chronology, because the Lackawanna Railroad operates this line we're talking about the 400 miles between New York and Buffalo until 1960. There's a merger with the Erie Railroad, which becomes the Erie-Lackawanna. That's operated until 1976. Conrail takes over April 1st of 1976 and continues to operate this line until the end of 1978 as a freight line only. Passenger service had ended on this line in 1970, so Amtrak never becomes involved with this line when Amtrak is created. What Conrail does, and this is, I'll say, part of history, so I'm not telling something out of school, but basically Conrail systematically tries to drive away customers, and it does so quite successfully. You can look at the length of the freight trains that when they first start, and then a couple of years later, the freight trains are basically, something you would see in a Lionel set, a few cars, and that's about it. The thing is that when that happens, that gives them justification for abandoning the line, which really, in my opinion, because Conrail was essentially created to save the Penn Central Railroad, the Penn Central people really just wanted their Penn Central, and the other ancillary lines, the Erie-Lackawanna, the Lehigh and Hudson River, the Central Railroad of New Jersey were all dispensable. They did keep the Reading, and the Lehigh Valley. The Lehigh Valley they actually had interest in, and they actually owned some stock. But essentially, this line and the old Erie line up through Port Jervis and such become superfluous to them. They don't need them. So fortunately, the state for the Erie route, the state of New York buys that, or I shouldn't say it buys it, but it subsidizes it heavily and it basically saves it. It doesn't happen here, unfortunately, and as a result, the Conrail literally sells off the cutoff in the beginning of 1986 to two different developers. And then that's where the whole thing starts as to whether those developers are actually going to literally take away the fills, like the Peak West fill, cart them off to the Westway project in New York. And that's where I become involved, and basically it becomes a fight to try to get the state of New Jersey to buy this right away to preserve it for future use. That's basically where the whole thing starts. But Conrail's abandonment on the line starts all that. Now you can argue from a philosophical perspective. Well, Conrail was given money, through, I guess, bonding and such, was able to basically, you could say, save Northeast U.S. railroading. But the thing is that what happens is that in doing so, it abandons, as you mentioned, a lot of branch lines, but even main lines as well, and then it recoups the salvage costs, which as taxpayers we paid for. Whether they paid it back is irrelevant. They actually were able to make money by salvaging, taking up the rail and such, and abandon these routes. And now the money to put them back, first of all, to acquire them and then put them back, has been enormous. And that's been the part of Conrail which is really, in many ways, has hurt, even though it saved freight service, you could say, in the U.S. or the northeastern part of the U.S., it has definitely had some deleterious effects in other ways, especially in passenger-wise, but even with freight as well. Not that this is ever going to be a freight route. It's not. I mean, I think there are definite reasons why you're not going to see any significant freight, if at all, any freight on this line when it's reactivated. But still, it has great value, in my opinion, as a passenger route, commuter/passenger. And that's really, I think, the impetus behind reactivating it. And we hope to be successful. It's taken a long time. A lot of people feel that we've taken too long and there have been too many promises made, and that as a result, many people are skeptical. And it's understandable that they're skeptical. But not everything gets done as quickly as you hope it would get done. And it's taken a long time, and I think, though, ultimately we'll be successful. But but we'll see. You know, that's one thing. I can't guarantee any of this, but I can guarantee there's going to be a pretty good fight to try to get it done.
So I've never heard it put into words what you just said, which was Conrail didn't care about the Lackawanna or some of the other railroads because they were mainly Penn Central. Do you think?
And New Haven as well. Of course, the New Haven was part of the Penn Central. You know, Pennsylvania, New York Central, and New Haven created what became Penn Central, which went belly up in 1970, and then now Conrail in 1976 is really primarily intended to save Penn Central.
So yeah, I guess back to the question. Do you think if Conrail was run differently, or there's a video on my channel that's about possibly if Conrail was nationalized completely, they would have saved a lot of these lines because they wouldn't have seen that they had to throw away lines, I guess. But I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
Well, they would have to, I think, in my opinion, written the laws differently that would have discouraged abandonment of rail lines. I mean, for a long time, they would admit it was difficult for railroads to abandon lines that were underperforming. The thing is that it can be argued that this one wasn't so much underperforming as it was a threat to Conrail's monopoly of the New York area. Now, whether or not it really was a threat, it certainly was treated as if it were a threat. But in terms of the bigger picture of the Northeast, what could have been done differently? It's difficult to say. It was difficult, I think, enough to actually save, or if you look at Conrail as saving railroading or freight railroading in the Northeast U.S., it was difficult enough to get that done. So in terms of like the nationalization, I don't think that was ever going to be in the cards. But could it have been done differently? Would it have saved this line? Maybe. But I think ultimately this line had to end up in public hands to really be in a position to use it for what we'd like to see it used for. Because freight railroading in the U.S. is almost exclusively a private enterprise. And the interests there are quite a bit different than what you see for passenger or commuter operations. Really quite a bit different. Not only politically, but also in terms of the goals and how it's funded and so forth. And as a result, it's difficult to integrate the two. And in this case, the reason why it was so important to get it into public hands was that really didn't think there was any way to reactivate the line without doing that. Well, we did it because, or had it done because it was the way to save it. Because this line was about as close to being dead as you can possibly imagine. I mean, to not only have it go into private hands, but actually where you have developers talking about actually destroying it. And then because all sorts of bad things happen legally when you abandon a line and take up the tracks. So that's why it took so long to actually get us back to the point where even the line is owned by one entity, which is a public entity. But now, now it's a question of having to spend the money to put the tracks back. So it's very costly. But what this is an example of, which shows you how difficult it is, and I think that's what a lot of people don't quite understand, is that it is incredibly difficult to reactivate an abandoned line where the tracks have been taken up. And there are so many different roadblocks that can be placed in the way. Not the least of which, of course, is funding, but it takes commitment over a long period of time. And hopefully, I've talked about it being symbolic, but could it be an example of it where you can do this? But in my opinion, when you talk about how difficult a particular project can possibly be, from the very easy to the impossible, this project is over here. It's not impossible, but it is about as difficult a thing to pull off as you can imagine. Even though a lot of people say, "Oh, why can't you get it done?" Well, it's not easy. This is not easy. We're in uncharted territory for the most part, and that's why it's taking so long. And nevertheless, there are enough of us that are involved with this that I think we're going to do it. But there's no guarantees. There's never any guarantees because, once again, this is about as difficult a project as you can possibly imagine.
On my channel, a lot of the people that I talk to in the urban planning groups, we often compare road projects to rail projects, and we always see rail projects in the United States is a lot harder to authorize or get funding for than road projects, unfortunately. And something like this, I think, like you said, would be very symbolic if it was completely finished, because it is something that went from nothing to something again, with just the intent of bringing passenger rail back.
Yeah, absolutely. What you put it better than I did, actually. And the thing is, with highways have a much easier route, so to speak, in terms of their funding. And there's no doubt that there is resistance, not just about this, but in general, that we're talking about competition between different lobbying groups, rail being one of them, of course, but the highway interests and the airline interests. And I would say it's safe to say that the airline folks and the highway folks see this as a zero-sum game. And that if high-speed rail starts now to take off, which I hope it will, that's money that those interests see that they're not going to be able to get. And that's why you've seen so many fights, sort of like in California, for example, because the thing is, that philosophically, America, the reason why it hasn't really embraced, in my opinion, high-speed rail is that it's not exciting to most people. Historically, railroads were exciting when they were new and they were, the rage. And then they became sort of like something, old stuff. I think that even though we've talked about incremental increases in speed, where you talk about 110 miles an hour, 125, I don't know that really excites people. I think you really, when you build something here in the U.S. that is something that really is state of the art, where you talk about 225 or something, really decent high-speed rail, you kind of kick down the door and start something that I'm sure that the highway people and the airline people don't want to see happen, because all of a sudden you're going to see, in my opinion, there's going to be more excitement to say, like, oh, why can't we have that? And once you build it one place, then somebody else wants it. And then, and before you know it, it takes off. Maybe maglev or, the stuff like that, where you talk about, ridiculously fast speeds. But that I could see the U.S. becoming excited about. I just don't know that, right now I don't think that spark is there.
I think one of the problems that a lot of people in the United States have is, like, for me, I live next to the Northeast Corridor. So every day, if I'm walking down the street on the New Brunswick Viaduct, I can see an Excella go by. And, like, in my opinion, it's a very real physical thing to see that, especially when the train goes by and, like, rumbles the ground and you can hear it and see it fly by. But a lot of people in the country have never experienced anything like that, so they don't think that something like that exists. And I think that's part of the, like, problem with high-speed rail.
I've heard a story about, this was a few years ago, a friend that had gone with a group in France, and these folks, the one friend was kind of a rail nut, I guess, and he'd talk about the high-speed rail stuff, and he was kind of treated as sort of like a little bit of a, I don't know, just a rail nut. And they just happened, wherever they were touring, they were just happened to be next to one of the TGV's main lines. And so they're standing around, and all of a sudden one of the TGVs come through at whatever, 300 kilometers an hour, or maybe even more. It just, one of these things. And he tells the story, it was like, jaws kind of dropped, because it's, you talk about it like, oh yeah, the trains are fast. It's like, yeah, you're right. Sure they are. And until you really see something like that, experience, you don't really realize it's like, oh, they really are really fast. And that's the thing. You're right. I mean, but I think that the U.S. tends to have such a myopic type of view, which in many ways has helped it many times through history, but it often hurt it as well, because we tend to think of, well, if it hasn't been done here, it might as well have been done on the planet Neptune, because it doesn't sink in until you actually have it done here. I mean, that's why I've always felt that, like, there's been this fascination with monorail, because you go down to Disneyland or Disney World or Disneyland, and you see the monorail. It's like, yeah, but that's kind of like, that's nothing. That's not really modern. It kind of looks like it should be, but it really isn't that fantastic.
I don't know if you've ever heard the word, but there's a word we refer to in urban planning to stuff like a monorail, or nowadays it's like the Hyperloop. And we call them
the tube, the tube thing, yeah.
And we call them gadget bonds, which, as you know, the German word for bond is like road, but a gadget bond is sort of referred to as a thing that's like a train, but it's not a train. But it does basically the same things, but it's like shaped weird, or it's styled weird or something. But essentially it's a train, but it's not.
Like a quasi-train or whatever.
Yeah, and it's to convince people that, like, oh, we can build this thing, but it's not a train. So yeah, that's very similar to what you're talking about.
But the thing is, though, that they're kind of, I see them as sort of like technological dead ends. That that the potential, they're cute and they look modern, but the potential just isn't there. Where you really talk about, like a maglev, I really kind of think of as something that we're in the U.S. where we talk about, well, the distances are too great between the cities. You can't, it doesn't work. If you go fast enough, it works, because as you would know, that when you go from inner city to inner city, if you can easily compete with airlines who have to go up. Well, of course, they have to sit on the ground, then they have to go up, then they have to go down. That type of thing. And it's possible if you go fast enough, you can compete with airlines. Whether we want to invest in that's a political question. But I think, once again, getting back to, once you get it done one place, it's sort of like that. You light a fire here and it starts to spread, but until you have that spark and you light it, there's nothing. So that's what's really needed. Will we see in 100 years where we're crisscrossed by hyperloops or whatever? It's possible. I mean, it's like something out of Flash Gordon, but I mean, it's possible.
I think regarding high-speed rail, I think we're very close to that spark. Because I think that even though the California one is taking a while, there is also the Texas Central, and
you're right. Actually, Texas probably will be done before California.
And then there is Amtrak upgrading a lot of their stuff. They're very, very close to upgrading the Trenton to New Brunswick high-speed corridor. So, and they just got the new Avalia trains. So I don't know. I think I'm being hopeful politically. In the next few years, I'm thinking there's going to be a big reinvestment into it, or at least I'm hopeful about it.
Well, it does come back. In my opinion, it does come back to excitement, and Americans they're not rational in many ways, and whether they can actually become excited about something, I think, has a lot to do with the building of something like this, where you're going to talk about trillions of dollars. There's going to have to be excitement about that. Yeah. But until we get to that point, I don't know that we'll actually see that happening. But once again, it has to start someplace. And once it starts someplace, that's where the fight is. And if it's successful, if it's something that's like, we really want to see that, we'd like to have, why can't we have that here, that type of thing, then that's a game changer. Whereas right now, we're still waiting. But
I think in a lot of ways, the younger generation, maybe my generation and younger, I think a lot of them are interested in like a lot of the different railroad projects, because it's something as you know, there's a lot of people in the United States that grew up and they have really never taken a train, or at least like never commuted in one, never taken one for like across country or anything. It's either been car or airplane, basically. But I think because of that, the interest of my generation, or maybe younger or slightly older, are interested in them again, because it's like it's something that we see traffic, we see the pollution planes cause. It's like, well, one of the big solutions to that is restoring something with railroads.
And I can echo that, because my generation, which I'm part of the baby boomer generation, we really destroyed a lot of that infrastructure, basically because of the car, the automobile. And there was not a whole lot of vision put into this. And actually that destruction was already in place before my generation, or at least the earlier parts of my generation. And I think you're absolutely right. From what I see is that, as it often is, that as generations move out of the picture and others move in, the philosophy changes over time. And that's what makes me optimistic that we're looking at a future where there will be a greater emphasis in this country on rail, or what we'll call rail type of technology. Hopefully a lot faster. Not that this line can't function at 80 miles an hour or 90 or 100 miles an hour as such, but when you talk about let's say going between New York and Chicago or whatever, you're talking about, I'll say, probably new infrastructure in order to sustain the speeds that we really want to have.
But this is more restoring the ability of like anyone in this area to use something like this.
Absolutely. And there is value to that, and it doesn't mean like, well, we have to wait for the new technology. Well, you can wait forever. We shouldn't make the good the enemy of or the perfect the enemy of the good, because we can wait forever for that maglev train to come, which would be great, but that's not coming anytime soon. But these are small, in a sense, baby steps that we're taking to the future. But certainly, I'll keep on using the word symbolic. The symbolism here, I think, would be something that I think this would draw a lot of attention, because this is not something that happens every day, to do this kind of a thing. In spite of the fact that it's taken a lot longer than we'd like it to take. That's a fact. We know that. But once again, I think that's really because no one really, when you haven't done something before, you don't know how long it's going to take. If this were 1950 and then we hadn't put a man on the moon, we say, well, it's never going to happen because we hadn't done it yet. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It takes time. So. Not this is putting a man on the moon, but it's in a sense.
Well, at least for the northwestern part of New Jersey, it is.
or it's it's almost literally recreating the wheel, or reinventing the wheel, because this is something that existed. It's not as something that didn't exist. It's like we're just, in a sense, going back to the future when we put this in.
Yeah, part of the reason why I wanted to do this project, mainly with the Lackawanna Cut, is there's something as impressive as this viaduct. And it's weird to me that something like this exists, and something as large as the Lackawanna Cut in general as an infrastructure project exists and then was abandoned. I just think that's so bizarre to me. But in the perspective of sort of the United States, I guess it makes sense from people moving away from rail. But in the world perspective, it's why would you do this? Yeah.
Well, at one time the U.S. had more rail than I guess the rest of the world combined, and true that there was a lot of overbuilding. There are lines that should not have been built.
Oh yeah, I'm from South Jersey originally, as you may have heard. And I grew up in Glassboro, which was a kind of junction town, and we had 3 different lines coming through Glassboro that were kind of redundant. But yeah, the cut was a main line though, so yeah.
Well, my son went to Rowan, so and I know they've talked about extending
Oh yeah, I've heard about that forever.
Yeah, and that's the same thing. And the tracks are there, so sometimes you think, well, here are no tracks. That's even more difficult. But just because you have tracks doesn't guarantee that you can easily extend service. It's a long process.
You'd be happy to know, though, that the EIS for that did come out last month. So they do have a plan now.
Well, that's the thing. And there's so many hoops that have to be jumped through. And if you take too long, there is and we've seen this on the cutoff, where you get regulation creep. So in other words, when you start at a certain time and you fulfill all the different regulations, the EIS, for example, the environmental impact statement, and all that stuff, and you think, oh, you're good to go, and you get the funding, and then all of a sudden the thing drags on a little bit too long, and all of a sudden something else comes on, and now you have a different regulation or a new regulation that you have to comply with, and that may cause further delay, and so on and so forth. So much of what we see with projects taking so long is because there are things that, like, it would be easy if things had stayed static and you meet a certain set of regulations and then you're done. Unfortunately, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. And this particular line has been, plagued by that. We've gotten to the point, though, now we're going to move forward to, but I understand once again why people are skeptical, but there are reasons. It's not like it's not going to happen because there isn't any commitments. It's because it's complicated. It's very complicated.
I guess to wrap things up, I'm very thankful that you were able to do the interview, and I'm very thankful that you know as much as you know, and that you've done as much work as you've done to save what you guys have.
Well, I'll say this, that I'd like to refer to myself as one cog in the wheel, and maybe one of the more visible cogs in the wheel, but there are so many people that have been involved with this project over the years, and we're talking, I see this project as really starting with even before the running of the Amtrak special over the line in 1979. But so we're talking now over 40 years, but there have been so many different people at different levels and in politics and advocacy and so forth. I have the privilege of being, involved with it almost through that whole period, even the dark periods where we're talking about no tracks, but there were some very dark periods where it really looked like the line was just literally going to be torn up, and not even just the tracks, but literally the roadbed was going to be torn up. And I think the optimism now is building such that maybe there's some belief that we might actually be able to pull this thing off, this reactivation of the line. But without all the different people keeping this thing going, and that's where I see myself as coming in, is helping to keep this project alive through times where there are times where the optimism drops and goes up and so forth. But I'm only one person, without all the other people who've been involved, this project would never happen. But we're in it together, and hopefully we're going to be successful. And that I think is what you really need to do something like this. You need a lot of different people in different places, and people, I want to say, that are committed over a long period of time. And that's the tough thing. This is not. We had one gentleman who joined my group many years ago. And when I talked him into this, one of the things I told him, I said, we're talking now over 30 years ago, I said, if you're looking for something to get involved with which has very quick type of resolution or satisfaction, this is the wrong project for you. I can tell you that. This will ultimately to be successful, this will be something that will cause you to be more than ecstatic, but we haven't reached that point. But this is a project that takes long-term commitment, and it's a long grind. And many people have come in and out and have left the project. That's fine. We understand that. Some people have only been involved very briefly, but have had very important roles, and that's been terrific as well. But I'm one of the guys who stuck through it, and you know, I'm looking forward to the day where I get to ride a train on it again. You know, after it's been 60 years since I've been on this line, so I'm looking forward to it. When that'll happen, I can't say, but I hope, you know, I hope to stick around long enough to be able to see, to ride across the whole thing, and who knows what else, you know. Yeah, maybe it's this is I'll say a visionary project, but I think we will reach the point where we'll see that it's more than that. This is more than just, in a sense, doing something just so that we can play choo-choo. This is much more serious than that. Even though we'd like to be able to see trains going across here, but if there wasn't that real impetus, then this would be just a waste of time.
I think, like we said earlier, this is symbolic of more of what a lot of the country needs. It's more like either commuter rail or intercity rail. And this is just one of those big projects that, if it's finished, then it kind of can inspire other places.
And that's exactly its value would be greater than just doing the project. You're right. Using the word inspiration, I think it would be. It would be an example of what, hey, they could do it. You know, this is, and I think that will be the at the very end, whenever that is, where you have trains running across the line. That's going to be the story. You know how difficult this was, but it was done, and the need for it, and
I think one of the big things is that when you restore rail to a community that didn't have it, or specifically like a younger generation or a few generations in this case that haven't experienced one, suddenly they see the option of travel by rail. Like it's a serious thing. It's suddenly something that exists, and I think that affects a lot of people.
Well, it certainly makes sense from the perspective that even if rail didn't exist, you would say, well, there'd be value. But I've talked to people, not recently, because I'm sure some of these people have probably passed away now, but I've talked to people like out of Blairstown, which would be one of the stops on the reactivated cutoff, and they talk about back in the 40s and the 50s, and they take the train into New York, and they viewed it, the railroad, as part of the community, and they saw it as a positive thing. I know there are people who are against this. And that comes along with the territory. There are going to be people who are going to oppose the reactivation of the line for various reasons. But the thing is that you can come up with reasons why you can rationalize why you would be opposed to it. But the thing is that it's not as if it didn't exist before, and there weren't people who, when it was here, I never heard anyone who remembers those days as saying, I didn't like it. It was something that was, in a sense, was taken for granted. Because I grew up in a town that has always had rail service, at least for the last 150 some odd years, more than that, 175 years. And if someone came in and said, oh, we're going to do away with this. Now, that's of course ridiculous, but let's say someone came, they'd be treated as a nut. I mean, you can't imagine. It's only because that it doesn't exist now that there can be people saying, well, we don't want this to return. There's going to be bad things that are going to happen because of it. Well, if you can talk to some of the people who remember when it was here, I think you get a different story. They're the ones who knew what it was like. Granted, it's a different time, a different operator, that type of thing. Be New Jersey Transit, not Erie Lackawanna or Lackawanna. Sure, that's different. It's a commuter operation, not passenger per se. Although you could have Amtrak, so that it could very well be a similar operation. But you're not going to convince everybody. There's always going to be not everyone's going to agree with you. That's fine, and we'll see. But I could see it as a very positive influence in the area.
Well, I'm very hopeful. Well, thanks again.